Hello everybody, and welcome to the next of our topics for the U.S. Modern History class. And this time we're actually going to be talking about the period during which the United States creates its own empire. When we use that term, it can bring up a number of different connotations and different meanings. The Roman Empire, or the Mongol Empire, or Alexander the Great, or the British Empire, those kinds of things. People that study imperial history look at each of those in slightly different ways, and certainly if we were to even claim that the American experience from an imperial standpoint is similar to those, we would be sort of misleading people. The American experience is quite a bit different. It is happening roughly the same time that the European powers are consolidating their empires, but the American quote-unquote empire is really pretty puny compared to the things that were created by the British or the French or the Belgians or the Spanish or Portuguese or Germans and so on. But it's important because it is a significant factor in the United States becoming a world power. And it's a significant factor in terms of helping us look at some underlying kinds of social and cultural and political conversations that are going on around the turn of the 20th century. So that's where we're going to go. This section is going to be broken down into two recordings. Neither of them should be terribly long. I'm going to do my best to really cut to the quick and get to the really essential material. Certainly, you should be reviewing the full PowerPoints on Blackboard, and certainly you should let me know if you've got any questions about any of the content at all. So here we go. So what's going on as far as America in relationship to the world prior to the 1890s? Well, essentially, Americans are isolationist. They want to remain sort of focused on domestic affairs. Certainly the United States is involved in an increasing degree with international trade, but by and large the country wants to sort of keep its nose out of other people's business and let Europe and Africa and Asia and South America kind of do their own thing. Most Americans, virtually all Americans, in the late 1800s are very, very reluctant when any sort of proposal or idea of American intervention comes up. But there are a couple of things that are going to start changing those attitudes. One of which is, as the American economy starts to grow, it draws the United States more into direct contact and direct commerce with other parts of the world. Partially, this is because increasingly there are raw materials that the country needs that it does not have available on its own. Partially, it's because, and maybe more so, because as the economy starts to power up, the United States needs new markets that it can sell its goods into. So as you have more exports, as you have more stuff being delivered to countries in Europe or countries in Asia or countries in the Caribbean or south of the border, as it were, is going to naturally draw the United States more into the kinds of international diplomacy and international affairs that it has been trying to avoid up to this point. At the same time, the United States also gets more interested in the actions of other Europeans, well, European powers, not other Europeans. And there are theorists and strategists and intellectuals and politicians that start to see the need for the United States to become more involved in global affairs for a variety of non-commercial reasons. One of these people is a man named Alfred Thayer Mahan, and Mahan writes a book in 1890 called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, where he argues that if you look at all of the very powerful societies throughout history, so the Romans or the British or the Portuguese or the Spanish, naval power was at the center of their influence and at the center of their strength. So naval power reflects the ability for a country to express force and express influence around the globe. So today, certainly the Navy is a powerful factor in America's ability to exert its will around the planet. Now, obviously, with new technologies, there is the existence of a ballistic missile system, there's the existence of the Air Force, those kinds of things. But in 1890, those didn't exist. And so really the only way that a country could spread its influence around the world is through the use of a navy. And so one of the things that Mahan is arguing is he's saying a powerful navy is the thing that makes a country powerful, because it can allow that country to exert military force wherever it wants, but it can also use the navy to back up more forceful kinds of diplomacy. And we'll talk about that in more detail when we get into Theodore Roosevelt and the idea of what's called the big stick diplomacy that he comes up with. One of the other things then that this has to do in terms of American expansion is Mahan says, look, sometimes when you have a large navy, you're not going to be able to provide the fuel and the food and the material resources necessary for that navy to operate everywhere in the world. Again, today we have ships that are powered by nuclear power plants. They can run sort of without refueling or without stopping for decades and decades. But in 1890, you need coal, and you need fuel oil, and you need things that are actually going to power the boilers and power the engines. And if you can't carry enough fuel with you to travel around the world, you need to be able to stop someplace where you can refuel and where you can resupply. That means that you're going to need to have colonies in places around the planet to provide you with access to that. And so Mahan's ideas are going to sort of open the door for a lot of politicians, military leaders, diplomats to say, maybe there is something to this American expansion. Maybe there is something to be said for establishing some sort of colonial presence outside the boundaries of the United States. So the thing that really kicks all of this off is a war between the United States and Spain. And the focal point of that is Cuba. So Cuba has been part of the Spanish Empire at this stage for almost exactly 400 years. So Cuba becomes part of the Spanish Empire essentially as a result of Columbus's explorations in the 1490s and 1500s, and Spain controls Cuba then all the way through the 1890s. But the Cubans, as you can probably imagine, aren't thrilled with the idea of being under the thumb of the Spanish, and so there is this sort of long-term independence effort in Cuba. And there are a lot of Cuban expatriates, a lot of Cubans that are living in the United States, and the United States then sort of gets drawn into the Cuban independence movement. It's known as Cuba Libre. And the public certainly supports it. The government is technically neutral, but certainly makes comments here and there that it expresses its moral support of what the Cubans are trying to do, but not getting directly involved. In 1898, the United States sends a battleship, the USS Maine, to the port of Havana, partially to send a message to the Spanish government, partially to protect American business interests in Cuba. The night of February 15th, it explodes. It is almost certainly an accident. Historians, even today, some are still a little bit uncertain or in disagreement about what the cause may or may not have been. It's never fully determined at the time or even since with any actual precision what the cause of the explosion was. But at the time, in February of 1898, American journalists portray it as sabotage, or as basically a terrorist attack. They immediately blame the Spanish, although they never really explain what the benefit to Spain would be of blowing up an American battleship. But Americans buy into this idea. President McKinley is reluctant to go to war. McKinley is the last American president to have served in the Civil War, so he saw combat. He knew exactly what war was all about, and he was not excited about the prospect of putting Americans into that situation. Even though Spain at this point was pretty weak, they were a hollow empire in a lot of ways, and so the United States didn't really have a lot to worry about. McKinley just realized that no war is an enjoyable experience, and he was reluctant to get involved. But yellow journalists, the pressure from people within his very cabinet and his government eventually force his hand. And so he's compelled to declare war against, well, to ask Congress to declare war against Spain, because again, the president does not have the power to declare war. So McKinley asks Congress to do so. Congress is more than willing to do that. And so the United States enters into the Spanish-American War. It is an extremely lopsided affair, whether you're talking about actions in the Caribbean or talking about actions that take place in other parts of Spain's empire. One of these lopsided battles happens in the Philippines, and the American Navy in the Pacific, it's under the command of George Dewey, wins an incredible naval battle in the port of Manila in the Philippines, where he pretty much obliterates the Spanish fleet there, which places us in direct control of the Philippines for about 50 years, a little less than 50 years. It's very, very tricky control of the Philippines, and it is something that's really worth reading more into if you have any interest in American foreign policy or the American empire or that kind of thing, or race relations in American history. It's a pretty ugly experience in a lot of respects. In the Caribbean, the Americans are active in Cuba, they're active in Puerto Rico, and this includes, if you've heard of the Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt's hand-picked unit, volunteer unit that he basically brings himself to Cuba and fights as a supplementary part of the U.S. Army. The Battle of San Juan Hill. Ultimately, the war lasts only 114 days, so not even 4 months. It ends August 12th of 1898. Of the 5,500 people, Americans, that die as a result of the Spanish-American War, less than 400 of that die in battle. The vast majority of American deaths come as a result of disease or other kinds of health issues, because the war is being fought in really tropical conditions that Americans aren't all that familiar with and aren't really prepared for. At the end of the war, the United States acquires a handful of possessions, basically strips Spain of what was left of its empire. Spain had been losing its empire throughout the 1800s, and so by 1898, there wasn't really much left anyway. But this does place America pretty much immediately into the position of being an international figure. And the map on the left shows some of the locations that the United States acquires as a result of the war. So Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, probably the most notable. The map on, or the image on the right is a political cartoon from shortly after the end of the war, which really sort of exaggerates the nature of the American empire, right? And it shows the eagle with its wings stretched all the way from Puerto Rico in the east and the United States and all the way out to Manila and the Philippines. right? An empire that's 10,000 miles from tip to tip, which is technically not that far off, but if you would look at the actual map, you can see that the vast majority of that 10,000 miles is empty Pacific Ocean. So it's not as though the United States was suddenly this juggernaut on the international scene. It is a bit of hyperbole to suggest that the United States empire is 10,000 miles across, because a lot of the distance between, say, San Francisco and the Philippines is water, and it's not as though the United States can really claim that for its own. But ultimately, the U.S. has now become an imperial republic, right? A republican system of government that now runs its own empire. And so immediately there is debate about whether that can actually exist, right? Is having an empire compatible with being a republic, with being a sort of nominally democratic system? And there are people that say no. They say the idea of democracy, especially a democracy that was created in the way that the United States was, that is by definition, basically, incompatible with running an empire where you do not treat everybody equally. If you are going to make the Filipinos, if you're going to make Puerto Ricans immediately equal to people that live in the United States, then sure, that's fine. If you're going to make them into states that are integrated into the Union, then obviously that's totally acceptable. But everybody recognizes that that's not going to be the case, and it still isn't the case, right? Now the Philippines has its independence. It gets that after World War II. Puerto Rico is a territory, so it exists in this kind of limbo between being nothing and being a U.S. state. And there is a lot of reluctance on the part of a lot of Americans at the end of the 1800s and into the 1900s to say, you know what, I'm fine with allowing, with allowing non-white populations that we have suddenly conquered their territory, allowing them to be equal members of the American system. And if you are advocating an American ideal that says, we were created in resistance to oppression, we were created because we didn't agree with a country trying to claim power over us without us having a say, you can't then turn around and do that very thing to the populations that you have brought into your empire, basically through no fault of their own, right? The Filipinos were engaged in their own attempts at independence. Suddenly, Spain is just being replaced by an American colonial power. So there's a lot of nativism. There's a lot of this, well, we white people are better than other parts of the world. We don't want to share our role as world leaders with non-white people. So we're fine with having them in subservient conditions, but we're not okay with the idea of bringing them equally into the fold. There are, though, those that say, yes, having an empire is a good thing. We've talked a little bit about some of the economic advantages, the strategic advantages, right? This is great because now we have new markets that we can trade with. We have places that will provide us with new resources. For instance, the United States isn't really a producer of natural rubber. You can get rubber from the Philippines, so that's a place where you can acquire raw materials that benefit you, but it's also a place that you can end up potentially selling some of the extra material that you're producing. There is a significant side of this that is missionary in nature, right? Lots of Christians say, hey, we see an opportunity here of bringing Christianity to parts of the world that don't have it. In the case of the United States, most of the Spanish Empire was already Christian. It was just the wrong kind of Christian for a lot of Americans, right? A lot of Americans in the 19th century were not, let's just say they weren't fans of Catholicism. And the Spanish, being one of the most powerful, most devout Catholic nations in the world, they bring Catholic Christianity into their empire. So the Filipinos, the Puerto Ricans, they were Christian, but they were Catholic Christian. American Protestants see this as a very big problem, and they say, you know what? Now is our opportunity to bring those misguided souls into the right kind of Christianity and spread that version of the faith. There is, certainly, a certain amount of sort of humanitarian enthusiasm for the idea of having an empire. We like to think of some of that as being very cynical and very false, right? Well, sure, they want to bring all the benefits of Western ideologies and capitalism and Christianity, when they're really just doing this because it's a racist white superiority kind of thing. And that's true to a point. But there definitely are people that see a colonial empire as an opportunity to uplift parts of the world that don't have the benefit of modern technology, or that from the perspective, from the kind of condescending perspective, but well-meaning condescending perspective of whites, don't have the benefit of Christianity, or don't have the benefit of the English language, or that kind of thing. And so yes, it's easy enough to be cynical and dismissive of that, but we can't get rid of those ideas completely, because a lot of times they really were people that honestly believed that this was a positive thing. And so it's a very fine line to walk in order to interpret how that actually plays out. Ultimately, though, there is this concept of the white man's burden. And Rudyard Kipling comes up with this term when he's writing a poem in 1899 where he's talking about the Philippines in particular. Kipling is making this comment kind of sarcastically, right? Oh, well, yeah, of course. White people are going to take on the responsibility of making everybody else, quote unquote, better. And by better, we obviously mean more like white people. But it becomes a very common kind of conversation in people that use it not sarcastically, that say, this is a responsibility. Whites of Europe or whites of America have all of these advantages, and it's an obligation for people to help improve the condition of other parts of the world, whether they want it or not, and whether it is in line with the cultures and traditions that that population has or not. And so the white man's burden becomes a very powerful kind of symbolic concept that a lot of people at the time use to explain or justify the actions that they undertake on behalf, quote unquote, on behalf of the colonial populations. It can be both very racist and very prejudicial, bigoted, as well as somewhat positive and humanitarian and altruistic and philanthropic. There is another concept that emerges at the end of the 1800s that doesn't really have as much of that philanthropy to it, and that is survival of the fittest, which people have probably heard. It's still a concept that floats around in a lot of different ways today. It's used by people that advocate racial superiority. It's used by people that advocate not having a welfare system, right? All kinds of things. Basically, it is a concept that is developed by a sociologist named Herbert Spencer. He is a devotee of Charles Darwin's theories of natural selection, but he is misrepresenting what Darwin actually says, right? Darwin never uses the term survival of the fittest. Darwin didn't believe that that's how nature selected organisms to survive and not survive. It wasn't a matter of being stronger than another organism. Darwin said it's just a matter of an organism being more properly adapted to its surroundings, so it survives to carry on its genetic legacy, where other organisms that are less perfectly adapted die off. It has nothing to do with strength or power or force or any of that stuff. Spencer, though, develops his ideas of what comes to be known as social Darwinism, which basically says, you know what? The strong survive. The white population has developed all of this technology. The white population has the capacity to move into parts of the world like Africa or Asia or the Americas, move into those places, take over those places, run those places as colonies. They can do this and they should do this because they are stronger than the populations that live there. And that gives them the right, basically a might makes right idea. So social Darwinism can be used in a lot of different contexts. In the case of this situation, though, it really is largely being used to justify a system of imperialism, a system of racism, that is based pretty much entirely on the misguided belief that Darwin's theories support a strong over weak kind of situation. And that's simply not the case of Darwin. It's a misrepresentation that Spencer applies to it, but it becomes a very powerful kind of explanation or justification for colonialism, for imperialism, for racism, and even, as I said, down to today, it's being used in ways to explain or justify attitudes regarding social or economic or political kinds of ideas as well. Even at the time, though, the response to the concept of the white man's burden or social Darwinism, it's kind of ambivalent, right? People are recognizing that it's not all one thing or the other. So the picture at the bottom right is the traditional belief of the white man's burden. This is based on the Philippines. It's based on the United States. The caricatures there are really pretty broadly drawn. You have this really stereotypically portrayed native person who is being carried up this hill to a schoolhouse. The person doing the carrying is pretty obvious to people at the time, certainly, obviously meant to represent Teddy Roosevelt, right? The way he's dressed, the kind of shape of the guy, everything is meant to be Teddy Roosevelt, sort of suggesting this is the responsibility of the United States now, right? The United States has taken on this obligation by acquiring a colonial empire, and now they have to be able to follow through with that, and through either coercion or force, get the populations of those colonies to become more white, to become more Western, to become more modern. But there are people, especially the British, because the top left picture comes from a magazine called Punch, which is a British satirical magazine. There are people that say, who is really carrying this burden, right? When you're talking about colonial possessions, it's actually the local populations, right? The native populations that are carrying the burden of doing all the production and all of the manual labor, breaking under the strain of having an oppressive, or at the very least restrictive colonial government. And so you see, Uncle Sam, the next guy back is John Bull, who's kind of the British version of Uncle Sam, being carried by people representing the colonies that these empires possess. And so those are the people who are actually carrying the burden of white imperialism, rather than the other way around, right? So it's It's a concept that has a lot of different meaning. It's a concept that has a lot of different applications. But it is definitely a concept that is significant in the way that people in America kind of understand this new reality. So that's where we'll pause for now. Our next section, our next sort of part of this topic will deal with Roosevelt as president. He really has a significant impact on the way the United States views its role in the rest of the world. And so we'll talk more in detail about him, more in detail about some of his concepts, some of his policies, and some of the ways that he makes those policies into actual action. So I hope everybody's doing really well. The next section should be a little bit shorter than this one, so kind of rest easy on that. And I will see everyone soon.